Welcome to HR Tech Talks, a video series that goes behind the scenes with HR professionals to share valuable insights and best practices when selecting and implementing new software. I'm Dave Rietsema, founder and CEO of HR Payroll Systems, a free web service that makes finding the right HRIS and payroll software for your business a whole lot easier. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Mary Dale, the VP of HR at Convivial Brands and former CHRO at Metron Integrated Health Systems. Here's our discussion. And so just to start off, can you tell us a little bit about Metron, the number of employees, the number of states that you were in, and some of the challenges
Yeah,
challenges you experience from an HR perspective that could be eased through an HRIS?
yeah. So when I joined Metron Integrated Health Systems, they had multiple locations. There were specifically seven, and they were looking to acquire additional. So one acquisition added, and then they had eight.
Mm-hmm.
With that being said, each location had their own federal tax ID. And there was around 850 employees across the state of Michigan. And when I joined the organization, they were going through a lot of change management to prepare for growth.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that growth was not only looking at ways to do things better and more effectively, but ways to reduce some of our cost. We had exorbitant spend that was very difficult to maintain. We didn't have a big budget to spend money on expensive softwares and what have you, as well as to add additional HR resources to do the job. And so as we were looking at some of the goals of the organization in the first year that I was there, a couple things that they were looking to do were to maintain some continuity amongst all eight locations. They were in different communities, different counties, spread out across Michigan. And one thing that we found is that from a recruitment standpoint, there was no continuity. Everybody was working independently on paper or having people fill out paper applications. So they weren't using the same system to pull together notes. So if one location that happened to be 15 miles from another were calling the same candidate, they would have no idea that a call was already placed to that candidate. We were also behind the market in regards to our total rewards and compensation program. And so one of the goals of the president owner, who is my boss, was to basically redo our entire compensation philosophy and structure, and then finding a system that would help us maintain that, not only from making sure that when we hired people on, our wages were not falling below the minimum or going over the maximum, and so creating those red circle opportunities, but also we wanted to ensure that we could implement a pay for performance model where individuals could go through a review, they could have a 360 review, they could do a self review, and all of those scores would tie to our budget, which then would basically dictate what their increase would. So that was one thing that we were looking at. How are we going to do this without manually calculating 800 plus people's salaries and growing as we continue to open new locations and expand our reach within the organization?
And so, what would you say besides that was a driving factor? Did you have bad customer service with your current vendor?
Yeah, so our current vendor, we would call or put in a help desk ticket for different features or problems, and there were times where we didn't hear back for 4 to 5 months on that issue. And in addition to that, we had implemented every possible upgrade and potential add-on product that they had said, if you implement this, or we just, came up with a new feature, if you'll implement this, and we did all of that,
Right.
but we still weren't getting the results that we needed, but yet we were spending the money. And so it was getting growingly frustrating because as you're calling and calling and calling and you're going, well, we have a serious problem here when it comes to trying to do our ACA reporting or our EEO reporting, and this information is not capturing accurate. We are going to have to go in and manually do a lot of this work, and they weren't doing anything to help us resolve those issues.
And so you decided that you needed to make a change. Customer service was an issue. You had implemented all these things that weren't doing the trick. So what was your first step in going through this process? So you made the decision, and then what?
Really determining what budgetary constraints or what the budget was. The next thing was looking at any technology constraints. So was the implementation going to involve other team members? And if it did, talking through what their availability was. Would you need any outside consultants from a technology standpoint?
Sure.
Did we have the broadband, or I'm not a technology person, but are there things that you need to use from server perspective that would require you buy space, or is it hosted in the cloud or on the internet? So where that software would be hosted was a big deal, I guess, for both the company but also our IT constituents. Looking at our time constraints, what other goals did we have as an organization that implementing a system would interfere with, and were they things that we would be able to manage both? And then once we did that, then we were able to start to evaluate, what vendors were out there that we could start taking a look at. This is where our needs are, and here are the vendors that we're finding meet or have different modules in their system that look appealing just from first glance, that we can start to take a look at and provide them with an RFP. And so we went through kind of that first analysis internally about what we could and could not do. The other thing we were looking at is training. How long would the system implementation rollout take? How long would training take? Because you can roll it out on January 1 to begin using January 1, but there's got to be a component in between there before people start to use the system. And then also looking at, any other annual costs, what the employee, was there an employee self-service portal, or would this be something that we would have to still have paper forms? So there was a lot of components that were a full 18-point checklist that we were looking at internally before we even talked to any software companies about that. And then before we even went through and started talking and doing the analysis with the companies, we had a project committee, mainly made up of HR professionals, but a few from IT as well as our accounting team, to determine, what impacts the software would have on them as well. And once that committee was selected, then that's when we started the formal RFP process and went through that process. And then from there, it was more demonstration and evaluation of the systems for all of those on the committee, just to determine that we had people looking at it from a different lens or scope.
Sure, like kind of setting the scene for this change to take place and making sure that
Absolutely.
you've got everybody on board. And did you find that there were any hesitations internally, or did you have to really get executive buy-in? How did that process go?
I will say in the years past, when I was new to this process and I didn't have kind of that external support or someone to walk me through what to expect, I really didn't know, and I was going into it blindly.
Mm-hmm.
I had a really hard time getting executive buy-in and selling the need for this, because all people saw and heard was that it was time, it was going to cost money, even if it was a flat dollar for dollar, there wasn't an increase, but we were implementing it. It was, other people's time. This time, I think because I've implemented so many softwares and I involved people that would be my naysayers or people that would tell me that we can't or that it's going to impact their department in that decision-making process, I did not find that we had a lot of pushback, because our system was so broken and we were looking to do so many very high-level strategic changes within the organization that we had to do something.
Okay.
And we weren't necessarily adding manpower. We had double the HR staff when I came on board, and then we restructured the entire HR team. So when we did that, we actually had a pretty significant savings for the organization by operating with less people. But by doing that, it required several changes in technology
Sure.
to do that, to have those efficiencies. So I didn't have those challenges, but when I initially, started my career and started with implementations, I found it was one of the biggest barriers and the most difficult struggles of going through this process, was not having somebody who had been there or who
Right.
was an expert at implementation to kind of help me through, that wasn't part of the software company.
Right. And I think, as a new HR person myself several years ago, I went through, this is one of the tasks that I was assigned as a new HR person. And I guess if you can sort of quantify, what these savings are going to be and really put things into numbers, which is not something that I think we're trained on as
Right.
HR people. But speaking to numbers and, what the cost savings will be and net present value, all of those things I think can help to sort of make the business case for HR software. But that's something you learn with time. But if you can be armed with that knowledge ahead of time, I think it
Right.
makes your uphill battle maybe not as steep as it already would be.
And in addition to the savings that you can quantify, I think now more than ever, where there is less people, just from a numbers perspective in the United States,
Hmm.
people are having less babies, and so less people are graduating from college, and so there's less professionals coming into the workforce, and so it's becoming more and more competitive as employers to not only have good compensation structures and to have great environments, but the tools that you provide for the ease of your employees to make changes, to enroll in benefits, to have access to knowledge and information at their fingertips has become so critical. People have come to expect it.
Sure. It's become almost a commodity, something that was,
Yeah.
new and uh, maybe not as necessary back when it was first introduced, has become just part of our lives. Like the reason that you said is,
Right.
it's just a part of our lives anyway.
Right. You're almost behind the times if your software company is a representation of who you are and what your company and where you're going. And so if you have 5 different softwares or they're broken or they're giving people misinformation, it certainly, while you may not have control over how that software does reports, what have you did select them, and it is a reflection of you
Yeah.
as an organization. I mean, one of the biggest things that I have found in my career is when my team members or even myself, if there's a mistake that you made, especially if it affects somebody's payroll, they don't ever forget that. They don't
No.
ever forgive you, even if you fix it later on.
Uh-huh.
They don't ever forget that, and there's that lack of trust with your department. So as an HR professional, I think this is such an important tool, but also to do your job, but also to represent who you are and to build those relationships with your employees.
Sure. So when you decided that you were moving forward, you've made your list, you've prepared your environment or your company internally for this. How did you, of course, going through a lot of implementations over the years, you sort of knew the vendor landscape, but how did you go about researching? Because it's constantly changing. There are always new vendors popping up. Did you Google search? Tell us a little bit about it.
So I did a variety of things because you're absolutely right. When, what software I might have evaluated at a prior company or, for another organization is not a one size fits all. A lot of times people will ask other HR professionals, like, who did you go with? And that simply means, oh, would you go with this one or would you go with this one? And it's like,
Uh-huh.
enough people say this one, so I'm going to make that choice. And that is one of the biggest mistakes that I see that HR professionals make, because each organization's needs and the things that you need from the software and your goals are going to be so different. Obviously, I mean, being part of different groups and finding out names, I started there with making phone calls. I started by, yes, exploring the different websites and scheduling reviews or demos of the system. I also
Mhm.
attended a few different local conference and national conferences which was kind of nice because many of them, if you are part of different HR groups, will attend and be part of the breakout session or what have you in between your
Sure.
sessions where you can go and evaluate. But I think, that's just a glimpse into the software. I think as anyone can appreciate, if you go on a car dealer's lot, they're going to really focus on all the bells and whistles and the things that really make them great during that presentation, but they're not going to take a deep dive, or they're not going to say, oh, by the way, this cup holder is kind of small. If you drink Gatorade, it's not going to fit in it.
Right.
They're not going to point out the issues to you. And so those are great ways to get demos and at least get a very, very high level look at the software. But from there, I think doing your own due diligence is so important. So once I saw kind of what each software had to offer, then I went out on a few HR forums. There's many of them that you can join for free on Facebook. You don't even have to know anybody, or other that I was able to tap into a network to say, hey, look, guys, who's using, any of you using this software? And can I schedule some time with you personally, whether it be via Zoom, whether it be coming into your office, to just do a review of your system. I'll sign a confidentiality agreement or what have you, but where you can show me how you're utilizing these tools, what this looks like in the real world being used, not in a demo software. And then I could ask some of my questions. From there, then I would go back to the vendor when I would see issues or concerns or things that maybe the person couldn't figure out, and would ask them to take a deeper dive.
Sure.
And what I found was about 70% of the softwares, for example, would tell me that they had a compensation platform where they could tie it to a review and what have you. And as I asked more questions, they really didn't have a compensation software philosophy that could even do that. Really looking in and taking a deep dive on those must-haves, I think is really, really important. Not just scheduling a demo, but asking them to show you. I had some vendors that I said, I want you to set up a dummy portal so that I can go in and play in your software. And many did. I was locked out after a portion of time, but they let me go into the test portion and try to do things, which was really nice. There were some that said absolutely not, or they wouldn't give me the time of day. And I have a feeling it's because they knew right off the bat that their software wasn't going to meet our needs. And I was very, very critical about what those things were, because many would try to shift back to other features of the system that were not important for us or things that we would even use. So
Right.
That was one thing that I found vendors like to do is they don't give you enough information to really do a full deep dive into the software.
Yeah. I think there are nice to haves and then there are have to haves. And I think
Right.
I found myself when I went through this process sort of getting distracted on all of these cool bells and whistles,
Yeah.
and sort of sometimes forgetting what are the crucial things that my organization actually needs to become more efficient and to get the job done. I remember specifically, email notifications, because our current system didn't have notifications. So when somebody got promoted or when somebody transferred, it would automatically let a specific department know about that activity. But that really wasn't the core focus of what we were looking for. We had other sort of bigger things that we wanted to focus on. Just being able to
Yeah.
automate other tasks, not even just specifically limited to letting other departments know about a specific thing. So I think your
I agree
strategies
with you.
is interesting, because you do a demo or you get familiarized with the product, then you meet with another HR professional to do a deeper dive, to really go through their use case and to see if it sort of meets your needs. With that arsenal of knowledge, then you go back to the vendor and say, here's what we need, here's what I experienced. Or did you disclose to them that you had worked with other people behind the scenes with another one of
Oh
their
yeah.
customers? Okay.
Yep. And I also, a lot of times if they use somebody as a reference, I would say, well, I also heard that this company is using it. Would you be comfortable me talking to somebody there? I know them and I'm comfortable with them.
Mhm.
And so that's how I'd kind of make that introduction.
So you got information from your networks, just talking to people. You did it through surveys.
Yeah.
of course, the actual vendor demo process. So you took a very thorough approach to researching the software to get to
Yeah,
the
I probably
conclusion.
drove people a little bit crazy with it. Just because there were some that people were like, oh my gosh, I love that software. And then, of course, at my research, I just would shoot it completely down. And they're like, oh my gosh, they're like, we thought that was great. I'm like,
Right,
you got sold on the salesperson and their presentation skills and how great they were, but it really, none of the stuff they presented really is what we're looking for, and they're not going to solve our issues here. And there were, like I said, compensation was a must have. We also, aside from HR, it was looking at what things could improve our operational leaders' workflows and lives as well. So this software wasn't just meant to solve our problems, but what were their pain points? And so in healthcare, especially long-term care, you cannot legally have a nurse working if they did not renew their nursing license. Well, you would easily think that a nurse who does this for a profession would renew their license, but people caring for people, as you can imagine, especially with COVID going on right now, they're so busy working double and triple shifts, and they're exhausted when they get home that they think, I'll get to that tomorrow. I'll get to that tomorrow.
right,
And if their license lapse even by a day, you can get into major trouble with major fines. And so finding systems that would track that, but then send reminders to the appropriate people when that hasn't been updated, that that's coming or that's expiring, that puts all
mhm,
the stops out there to make sure someone can't clock in if that's the case. So going beyond the needs of automation for HR, but finding tools to help leaders better manage so they can focus on the things like patient care that are of the utmost importance, and not all the minutia of paperwork
right.
that comes along with it. So that was a huge piece too, is finding systems that weren't only solving HR problems, but solving the problems of others in our organization.
Sure, and that helps to also get people in your corner to
Yeah,
really sort of sell it to executives is that sure, it's going to make HR's lives easier, which we all want, but if we can also take off some burdens from our peers and our managers, I think that's a huge win. And it also is a solid point to bring forth, hey, we can help with compliance. Hey, we can help this department become more
right.
efficient as well. So it's maybe not just about spending less or trying to sort of break even with current spend. It's also bringing in those other efficiencies. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Training, annual training that people are required to have. If you're like, we were open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So there was no time to say, okay, everybody meet at this space at this time to do your training, because somebody was always caring for patients who were there 24 hours a day. And
sure,
so finding tools where people could do self-learning, we could do on-site learning if they want to read versus a video, being able to upload videos, have proof we did the trainings. All those things were tools that didn't necessarily improve necessarily our jobs as HR, but it improved the roles of the nursing directors of nursing or the administrators whose licenses were on the line if those things got missed.
right. And so, how many total vendors did you evaluate?
I think it started somewhere around 15 to 16 as a high level evaluation, but at
Yep.
the end there was 4 to 5 that we really narrowed down on. Each was a little bit different. We had one that was more costly, but it had all the bells and whistles. We kind of had a few at that mid price point that was affordable, and then we had one that was on the lower end of cost and features wise, but they all fell kind of within our budget, and we wanted to see, was that top end software, was there something that they were offering that would be different than the middle of the road three? And ultimately there really wasn't anything that was that difference, other than they were charging 6 times the cost of the other
Wow.
vendor. And for the features that we needed internally, we felt the vendor we selected had stronger modules and things that responded better to our needs than the more expensive product.
How did implementation go, and about how long was it?
Yeah, so the first time I would say it was around 90 days to to 4 months to actually implement, from a starting to gather information to actually running our first payroll. One of the things that they had asked us to do was put things into a spreadsheet. And I think that the implementation out of the entire process of selecting a vendor was the most difficult and most challenging.
Yeah.
If you haven't necessarily used the software before, sometimes they're asking you to fill in information and you don't know where that information's going, what field in their system it's going to fill. You don't know what, when you run reports, what information that's going to drive or impact in the long run. And you certainly don't want to have a situation where you implement a software and you dump all this information into the system and it's garbage. And then you're
Right.
trying to manually fix it and correct it. Part of an implementation process too is leaving yourself enough time to test the system and set up test employees. Far too many people implement a system and then they just try to start using it, or say, I'm going to do a double payroll without really testing all of the features. A lot of times, most of these software companies, they focus on payroll only as part of, like, they'll say, oh, we're going to implement this in phases and we'll do payroll first and then we'll get to the bits and then we'll get to this. And guess what? You never get to those things because the implementation team helps you figure out how to run payroll and then they walk away and you've paid a lot of money for that implementation. And so those were some of the things, making sure that all the modules that they agreed to have implemented before the true go live date, that everything would be trained and set up. Sometimes that is what the cost difference is in the software. Is you may have all the features, long term the software may be phenomenal, but the implementation process could be a nightmare. And so it's evaluating even your own team members and their capabilities, both from a technology standpoint, but also the ability to juggle multiple projects and implementation and ongoing work. That's really important too. I was fortunate enough to have very savvy individuals on my team that were really great with technology. And we found that most of the time through the implementation process, we were teaching the vendor about things that would work with their system that they told us wouldn't work. And we'd be like, well, let us show you. We found this or we found that.
Right.
So it's, assuming that when you're meeting with people, implementation people aren't always experts. Some of them may have just joined the company. Some could be 6 months into their tenure with the company. And so that was something else that I put in my contract for this time, was getting to select my implementation team and talking through them and understanding their knowledge. And if they weren't up to par, being able to change somebody from the team to get a better qualified individual.
What would you say are some things that went bad during the process that we could learn from? If you could pick one or two things that just didn't go well.
Really not knowing some of the spreadsheets and things that they were asking for, what they called the features were different than what we would have called those fields. And so things were put in fields that we wouldn't have called it that, and vice versa. And so we found ourselves doing a lot of rework and fixing the system before we could use it. And I wish that there would have been some sort of like list with, this is what this means, or that we would have taken it one step further before we started the implementation and did a demo of, here's what these fields mean in the system. So now that you've signed off on with us, this is what the system is going to drive. If you run XYZ report, this is what this is going to impact. And then also there were fields that if you were to make, let's say, a compensation change, they didn't tell you you had to go to 4 different areas of the system to make the change. And so, not knowing that, and then looking at a system and thinking, well, we changed it here, but then finding that there were multiple areas in the system that you had to also change that information was quite frustrating.
Right. Mary, thank you so much for all of your insights. This has been great, and I know it's going to be a huge help to other HR professionals who are going through the same thing. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you for having me.